In a world where algorithms and financial incentives dictate the information we see, it's easy for important stories to slip through the cracks. This is powerful because it can heavily influence and divide public opinion. Much of what I do on Software Underbelly is about digging deeper and trying to see beyond our own biases. And this is why Ground News is a perfect fit for my channel. On any given news story, their app and website combine every article published on it worldwide. We can also see context on each news source, like where it may fall on the political spectrum and how credible it is based on use of subjective language. This is important to think about if you're interested in forming an educated opinion on topics that are in the news, especially on key issues as we head into a polarized election season. I particularly like their blind spot feed, dedicated to showing news stories that are underrepresented in mainstream media. So I encourage you to check them out at ground.news/SWU. Subscribe through my link to save 40% off their Vantage plan. By subscribing or even gifting it to someone you know, you're helping hold the media accountable, and you're helping support this channel. Thank you for watching.
When I first appeared on this channel, I told the story of greed in the pharmaceutical industry. That's an easy story to tell because the pharmaceutical company has a very, very simple business model, greed. But like any story that is dark and has human suffering involved, as this one does, there should be a little bit of hope at the end, maybe a flicker of hope. And this story does. It's dim, but it has a flicker of hope. And it reaches back about 50 years ago when I was just out of my teens and I was working on a tramp steamer called the Sovereign Edith, a Liberian tramp steamer. And in the mess hall I saw, when we were in port in New Orleans, I saw this one seaman there, sailor, and his pallor, and something was about him, and he had this large lesion on his face. And I found out his name was Victor. He was from Ecuador, and he had skin cancer. As I heard, they cut it away, and then it grew back. And I could tell that Victor was on that lonely road to death of cancer. And it was my first real confrontation with cancer. And I befriended Victor, and his job on the ship was called Donkey Man. And that really is self-descriptive, because on the ship, in the bowels of the ship, where the engines are, and this huge turbines that turn the screw, all of this machinery is handled by what they call wipers. Now, wipers do exactly what that sounds like. They wipe all this machinery down, and they squeeze the grunge and the gook into these two large buckets. When they're full, they're put on a yoke, like a donkey, and the donkey man goes up these scaffolding 80 feet up, and this is in the scorching heat of the tropics, and goes to the poop deck, which is the stern of the ship, and dumps them over. Now, I know that sounds terrible in today's ethos, but this was another epoch. So he does this all day long. And he was at the end of his rope, and I befriended him. So I started helping Victor. I'd spell him, let him rest, and I would carry his buckets up and dump them into the sea. And he was a real nice man. He had a couple of kids and a wife, and he was working. He wanted to keep working as long as possible to send money home. I lost track of Victor because we were in Puerto Limon, Costa Rica, and I got very sick. I had to be rushed to a clinic there. I never saw Victor again, but he died shortly after that. I'm sure he was on his way to death. So now we flash back a few years after that, and I'm off the ship. I had taken a new bride, and I was working. And my sister, I had two older sisters, Phyllis and Carol. They were 9 and 8 years older than me, respectively. And my sister Phyllis had developed breast cancer. A lot of this is a haze in that time period, but she went to Memorial Sloan Kettering. She had treatment, it recurred, and she was very, very ill. She had two young boys, Mark and David. And one day, my wife and I are in our apartment, and the phone rings, and it's my mother or my sister. They're at Phyllis's house in Oyster Bay, and they said something's wrong with Phyllis. Of course something was wrong with her, she had cancer. But so my wife and I raced to the house, and there are my parents and my sister, and they're standing there in shock, just glazed over. She's upstairs. So my wife and I went upstairs, and my sister Phyllis is propped up against the bed, this glazed over look. I knew she was dying. She was dying right there. My wife brought her to the floor, trying to give her mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Finally, the EMTs come and take her to the hospital. We follow in a car, And we get to Glen Cove Hospital, and the doctor comes out shortly after that and said, "I'm sorry, she's dead." The grief was so profound to my father that when we got back to the house, I literally had to carry him into the house. Okay? He died a month to the day that Phyllis died. But Phyllis was only 35, and she had two kids. They were Mark and David. They were, I believe, at 5 and 7 at that time. And it fell upon my wife and I to go pick them up from Catholic school and tell them that their mother had died. So we drove there. They come out in their uniforms and get in the car. I pull over, and they called her Mamina. And I said, "Boys, I'm very sorry, Mamina's dead." And with that, like little puppies, tears bubbled in their eyes, and they started crying. So it was a profound moment for me. And then shortly after that, my other sister, Carol, develops a cancer called cutaneous T-cell lymphoma. Her type was called mycosis fungoides. Fungoides because mushrooms. And it's an exogenous cancer that manifests on the skin outward. The tumors are on the skin. It's of biblical proportions what it does to the human body and the human soul. So she was dying, but this took a long time. And I'm talking, so 20 years of my life were basically filled with cancer, one long string of cancer. When Carol was at the end, I remember I had a restaurant in Syosset called Ron & Lou's Cafe, and we were going out of business. It was a hellhole. I was living on vodka and Marlboros at that time. And Carol asked me, I went over on during break she lived close by. And again, she was toward the end at this point. Her suffering was so severe and unremitting that she asked me to kill her. She asked me to help her kill herself. So I go back to the restaurant and forget this pounding sense of guilt that I'm still alive and these people have died and the suffering she's going through. And I walk up to the bar and this big Irishman's there. I'm Steve McQuaid, 6'4", with a handlebar mustache. And I went to my bartender like this, and you know what that meant. And she took a pint glass, put some ice in it, vodka like this, little grapefruit juice. I went, and this guy, Steve McQuaid, went, and he could drink. And I went again. She did it again. So just to self-medicate from this. So then, several years later, I end up back in cancer, in the cancer industry. First as an editor, a managing editor, then as a freelance writer, which I've done for 35 years, along with research. So I'm still in cancer. And then something interesting happened. I was reading an article about a clinical trial by this guy named Dr. Muni. And in it, he was a head and neck cancer specialist, but he was doing research, a clinical trial on cutaneous squamous cell carcinomas. Okay, so one of the three major skin cancers. And what he was doing, he was taking high concentrate hydrogen peroxide, which is not like in the house, it's food grade, and it's between 33 and 35%. And he was rubbing it with a Q-tip, on these lesions. And he was doing that for one reason, just to reduce the surgical margins, okay, for cosmetic reasons. Because everybody knows that H2O, hydrogen peroxide, has cytotoxic properties. It kills cells. He was flabbergasted at the end because I was talking to him, and he said, "Ron, 70% of these cancers with one application vanished." And then I went back a month later for rebiopsy. All the cancer cells are gone. Wow, this is very interesting. So I kept this in my head, and I'm doing my own research. And I went to the dentist, and my guy Larry Schwartz, and he sees in my tongue. He says, "Ron, you got a spot in your tongue. I don't like the way it looks." Put it off. So I went up to Maine with my wife, and I'm brushing my teeth. I said, "Wow, this thing had grown, and it was ugly, and it looked like a squamous cell carcinoma." Now, if there's one you don't want to get any cancer, but if there's one cancer I do not want to get, it's head and neck oral cancer, because the treatments are worse than the cancer itself. They'll do, like, for instance, a partial or total glossectomy, take out your tongue or half part of your tongue, a mandilectomy where they cut out part of your jaw. It's horrific, and you don't survive. Anyway, I'm looking at this. My wife is freaking out. So I get back home, and she goes, "You got to go see Larry. You got to go see Larry, the dentist." And it's growing exponentially. And because I know about cancer, I know that this is dysregulated cellular growth. There's something really wrong, and it looked ugly. I go to Larry and Dr. Schwartz, and he says, Ron, you've got to go see a person right away. I'm really concerned about this. And he goes, I'm going to send you to this oral surgeon, but he's also an MD. He's the best. He's a medical doctor on top because I'm very concerned about this. I said, okay. Well, I got some high concentrate hydrogen peroxide, 35% hydrogen peroxide. The appointment was about in a week. So I start rubbing it, blanching it until it blanched. Did that twice a day, 3 days, and I'm also making a solution with a little bit of the hydrogen peroxide in it and gargling. So I went to the oral surgeon about 7, 8 days later, and I'll never forget, I sit in the chair and he comes over very serious, and he's got his tools all there, the nurse put there. He's going to do the resection, he's got his scalpels and all this, and the lesion, my tongue, is up on this screen, okay? It's an ugly lesion. I'm looking, and he looks at it, he goes, yeah, we got to really take care of this. Open your mouth, please. I open my mouth, and he goes like that. He looks back at the screen, and he looks at my mouth. He says, who are you? I said, I'm Ron Piana. He said, well, where is it? It disappeared. So I told him what I did, but his eyes glazed over, okay? It just didn't want to hear it. That's what I call the look when you explain something like this that's out of their comfort zone. The thing was, you've got to come back. You've got to come back in a month, because went back in a month, nothing. It had cured this lesion on the tongue, which was a suspect of a squamous cell carcinoma. So I start doing a lot of research with this. Now I say, wow, something's really going on here. And I realize that it goes back many, many years, okay? This is not a newsflash, okay? Hydrogen peroxide is a reactive oxygen species, and it kills cells. So anyway, I'm doing research on this, and I find a person that has a lesion on, and I brush it like this 2 or 3 times, it disappears. A friend of mine, an associate of mine, Bert Vorsman, who is a doctor, and he's a retired surgeon, a big-time surgeon. He worked with the NCI and so forth, published 1 million papers. He's an outdoorsman. So he had 4 lesions on him, 2 on his face and 2 on his legs. And he went to the doctor. They were medically diagnosed as squamous cell carcinomas. So Bert, instead of going, he's a doctor, instead of going through the Mohs surgery, all of the standard of care, he does what he calls the Piana protocol. So he gets the high concentrate hydrogen peroxide, gets a Q-tip, rubs it until it blanches, does that 3 times. All 4 of these things are gone. Went back to the doctor, and the doctor said, what the hell happened, Bert? And he said, well, use the Piana protocol, this hydrogen and Bert said his eyes glazed over because it's out of his comfort. They don't want to know this. First of all, skin cancer, dermatology is a $1 billion industry in this country. So put that in your thought process. So this goes on, and I wrote a paper for this guy, Dr. George Lundberg, who Dr. Lundberg was the longest-running medical editor-in-chief of JAMA, the Journal of American Medical Association. Big-time doctor, and he's a supporter of me. And I wrote a piece about what I did with my tongue and Bert Vorsman and so forth. And it got a little bit of notice. He's not well known. I mean, his blog isn't well known. But I would get people that would email me, and I would explain the protocol, say I'm not a doctor, and explain the protocol to them. And lo and behold, I'd get these emails back. Ron, thank you so much. It worked. It changed my life. I didn't have to go to the doctor. This medically diagnosed squamous cell carcinoma, it's cured. So I'm going on, and there's something here that's, okay, because in cancer you rarely, if ever, use the word cure. But this was curing squamous cell carcinomas. Now, between basal and squamous cell carcinomas, it kills about 420,000 people a year. Squamous cells alone kill 15,000 Americans. Okay. So I'm continuing to do this research, and I get to the point where I'm getting some pushback from people. But let me tell you how this works. And it's a biochemically complex process, but it's really not. So if you're looking to defeat something, you look for its weaknesses, right? I did a little amateur boxing when I was a young guy at a Gleason's gym over here on 33rd Street, no longer there. So in boxing, like anything, any sport, you look for a weakness. So if a guy's throwing a left jab and he drops his right hand, he's open for a left hook. Always look for weaknesses in something you want to defeat. So I was doing research and continuing, and lo and behold, the cancer cells, first of all, 90% of all cancers are carcinomas. Right? Carcinomas arise in the epithelial tissue that line the organs and the skin, 90% of them. And almost 90%, the vast, vast majority of carcinomas have two deficiencies, two weaknesses. Number one, they don't produce enough of an enzyme called catalase. Catalase's main job in the body, in the cell, is to neutralize hydrogen peroxide. That's what it does. Okay? The other weakness is because of their hyperreplication that cancer cells have, the dysregulation, they need more iron than normal cells. Okay? So they draw more iron out of the blood than a normal cell. So think about that. So they have excess iron and not enough catalase. Hydrogen peroxide, H2O2, is a small molecule, called small molecule. So it has the ability, when it encounters a carcinoma cell, it has the ability to diffuse into the cell, and it builds up because the cell, the cancer cell, does not have enough catalase to break it down into harmless oxygen and water. Okay? So it's building up. And then the other thing is, because of the excess iron, it initiates what's called the Fenton reaction. The Fenton reaction produces a thing called the hydroxyl radical. Hydroxyl radicals kill the cell. It's called liquid peroxidase. And what that does is it breaks down the bilipid cell membrane and kills this cancer cell. This happens every single time. It's an irrefutable process that always happens when H2O2 encounters carcinomas. It kills them. Okay. So here we have a situation that this is known, okay, but it's not being prosecuted. It's not being properly looked at. Well, for one, because of the huge financial situation involved. I'll give you an example of how compartmentalized and protective these people are. So years ago, I was working in corporate, and I was given an assignment to profile this doctor named Dr. Bernard Fisher. Bernie Fisher is like to be called. Bernie Fisher is probably one of the most revolutionary doctors in cancer. It was Bernie's work. Prior to Bernie, if a woman had breast cancer, she would undergo what's called the Halsted radical mastectomy. It was named after William Halsted, who was a New York-based physician who developed this. He was also an IV cocaine addict. I mean, I don't hold anything against that. Doesn't make him a bad person, but I don't know if I'd want somebody whacked out on blow operating on me. But he eventually got disbanded. But this was the standard of care for 60 years. It's a mutilating procedure in which both breasts are taken off, the muscle tissue along the breast are taken out, the axilla, the lymph nodes. It's debilitating and life-altering. Bernie Fisher's work, his groundbreaking clinical trial work, proved that lumpectomy, breast-conserving surgery, was just as good, had better outcomes than the radical mastectomy, the Halsted radical. So Bernie Fisher's work revolutionized the treatment of breast cancer. It was a win-win for women. They no longer had to have this mutilating procedure. They could retain their breasts and so forth. So Bernie told me that he was at a post-meeting cocktail hour one day, and this elegant woman comes walking over to Bernie, and he thinks she's going to ask him, has a glass of wine in her hand, ask him about the meeting. She walks right up to him and says, "I hate your fucking guts." She was the wife of a surgeon who did the Halsted radical. Now think of this. This was proved to be the wrong procedure in favor of the breast-conserving surgery. So it violated medicine's first precept, do no harm. But these surgeons were protecting their franchise, even though it was against the central premise of medicine. That's how ingrained into the financial aspect is that I talked about in the first video. So I'd like to just sum this up. First off, when I say hydrogen peroxide, it's not what you have in your home, the 2 to 3% in that little bottle that you keep for put on scratches. This is between 33 and 35% food-grade hydrogen peroxide. It is very powerful. If you pour a little on your skin, it will abrade it. It'll turn white and you'll feel it. So this is very, very caustic stuff. It's a very reactive, okay, number one. The H2O2 molecules, okay, when they interact with the carcinoma, it always happens. This is irrefutable. That biochemical process that I described with the lack of catalase and the Fenton reaction happens, and then it produces a hydroxyl radical that ultimately kills the cell. It is very rapid cell death. Okay, so this is, as I mentioned, this is known science. It's science that's irrefutable, and it's been around for a long time. It's called oxidative stress therapy because you put oxidative stress on a particular cell and it breaks it down and kills it. However, any attempt to do this has been done trying to get a prodrug or an agent to deliver this, always looking for that billion-dollar blockbuster drug when it's right there in front of you. Now, again, hydrogen peroxide has been sort of co-opted by the alternative community, and they've done a lot of stupid things with it, and they've given it a bad name. So mainstream medicine use that when anybody brings up hydrogen peroxide. However, the science is there, it's in the literature, and you heard it right here. I dare anybody, there's nobody that can refute this. So I'd like to sort of wrap this up in a bit with a thought experiment. And I'll use somebody very prominent in the oncology sector. Richard Pazdur. I've met Dr. Pazdur many times. He's the head of the oncology drug division of FDA, one of the heads. If there's anybody over the past several decades that has been more prominent in the drug approval process, cancer drug approval process, it's Rick Pazdur. He's been nicknamed the oncology czar, the drug czar. So, Dr. Pazdur, here's a thought experiment. If, unfortunately, you were diagnosed with glioblastoma, the deadliest of brain cancers, you'd have two choices. Okay, number one would be standard of care. The surgeon open your skull, resect, take out the tumor as much as possible. Then you would undergo concurrent treatments of radiation therapy and temozolomide, a drug that was approved 25 years ago, very caustic drug. And then, when it recurs, you'd be given Avastin, which, as Genentech, the developer of Avastin, in its own data says, it does nothing to improve survival or symptoms. So, the data also show you'll be dead within 12 to 18 months. Those 4 standard of care treatments you have. You'd be essentially tortured to death for 12 to 18 months. Or you have this other option that was made available. A neurosurgeon can open your head, open your skull, expose the glioblastoma, and have it injected multiple times with high-dose hydrogen peroxide around the periphery and it would be image-guided with a sonogram so that needles would go in all the places. So we know we'd have tumor saturation and then a bit around the periphery. Which would you take? To me, that's a no-brainer, okay? What's so ironic is that it's not unusual for neurosurgeons, when they're doing a glioblastoma resection, to put cotton balls that are soaked in hydrogen peroxide in that cavity, as they say, to pick up errant cells that they missed, to kill errant cancer cells that they missed. It's absolutely maddening. So right now, we have a cure for squamous and basal cell carcinomas. We have a methodology that's used, that we take from that cure, that could be used in other cancers. Unfortunately, this is another thing. I got an email from a woman in Canada, lovely woman, and her young son had what I had, a lesion on his tongue. The dentist didn't pick it up. It ended up to be squamous cell carcinoma, and it metastasized. They did a partial glossectomy, and she said it was just horrible. They took out most of his tongue. He ended up dying. And she said in the email, Ron, I wish I had read your article on Dr. Lundberg's Cancer Commons about the hydrogen peroxide and about your experience with the lesion on your tongue. It probably could have saved my son. So lives are being lost here. This is a simple, effective way, cost-effective, to treat these carcinomas. Dr. Muni, who I first saw the trial of in years before, he said, yes, this merits more clinical studies. I called him up. Where are they? They're not there. Would I trust the federal government to conduct clinical trials on squamous cell carcinomas with H2O2? Fuck no. They would subvert it. I know they would subvert it because this is a multi-billion-dollar industry. One of the huge problems in cancer right now is that we are operating on recycled ideas. The same ideas, we put a little gloss on them, but they're being recycled. And the Cancer Society, everything about oncology and cancer is living in a fortress of dogma. And to break that dogma wall down will take a populist revolution, I think, to finally say enough is enough. Let's get some new ideas in here, like the one I described today. Okay, like the one I described today. Let's get some new ideas. Let's get some fresh scientists who are not tied to pharmaceutical companies. Scientists like Bernard Fisher, who I described, who was the pure scientist. When he picked me up in Pittsburgh, when I went to his house, he looked at me and he said, Ron, to know my work is to know me. That's it. He was the pure scientist. He cared about results. So we can do this. I'm confident, but it's going to take things like this to get this out, and I'm going to keep doing my part on this. Lives are being lost unnecessarily, and we have unnecessary suffering. I'm very confident that we will prevail and we'll find a cure for cancer. I've elucidated one cure for cancer right here on the Soft White Underbelly. Thanks for listening. Peace.
Thank you, Ron.